Hello and welcome to all that are attending this Harbor Renewal virtual event. I'm Greg Taylor coming to you from Tulsa, Oklahoma at the site of a 1256 movement build, a new home for a black family to increase home ownership for black families and equity in a place where redlining and historic discrimination in housing has occurred. Tulsa World reporter Randy Crable and historian Carlos K. Hill said the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre was the deadliest outbreak of white terrorist violence against a black community in United States history. What happened on May 31st and June 1st, 1921? Well, as we look at the history of the early 1900s, Tulsa was a thriving community, and there was also a thriving black community and a lot of jealousy across the streets where white people lived in this very segregated town. The black community was called Greenwood. Meanwhile, there was vigilante violence that was done, extrajudicial violence called lynchings that were happening in that era. Black men were coming back from World War I, seeing freedom in Europe that they weren't experiencing here at home. They determined not to allow any more of these lynchings. On May 30th, 1921, a 19-year-old shoe shiner named Dick Rowland was going to one of the few buildings in Tulsa where he could go in and go to the bathroom. It was Memorial Day. There were parades, there were honoring veterans on the streets of Tulsa. And Dick Rowland was going into the elevator in this building. And he went in and tripped, or something happened to where an elevator operator named Sarah Page, 17 years old, white young woman, screamed. Dick Rowland ran, and then the rumors ran as well. The store that they were in, someone came to her aid. Dick Rowland was later captured and questioned and then released and not charged. Sarah Page said nothing ever happened. But there was a Tulsa Tribune story with the headline, "Nab Negro for Assaulting White Girl." The rumors spread throughout town that there was going to be a lynching. Dick Rowland was taken into custody and kept at the city jail, the county courthouse at a different time. And a white mob gathered at the county courthouse on May 31st. Into the evening, the white mob was gathered, attempting to break Dick Rowland free and then lynch him. It had happened before. Meanwhile, a group from Greenwood, the black men who were armed, some of those World War I veterans, came to the courthouse in order to make sure Dick Rowland would not be lynched. They were told by Sheriff Gustafson to go home, that everything was okay, that he would be safe. They did, and then they came back later as the rumors kept flying. A larger group of close to 100 black men came armed to the county courthouse where Dick Rowland was being held. It was into the night of May 31st that a white man tried to disarm a black man. The gun went off, someone was shot, and then there was a gun battle on the streets where almost a dozen black and white men died on the streets of Tulsa. The next morning, on June 1st, 1921, white men gathered along the line that went into Greenwood. They had been, many hundreds of white men had been deputized by the city of Tulsa police and given guns in order to go. And as one white person reported, was being told by a policeman to get a gun and get a black person, but they used the N-word. Get as many as you can. And so the white mob, some deputized by the police, came to Greenwood. Early in the morning at dawn, there was some sort of a signal, a whistle or a bell, and then white people came into Greenwood and started the most deadliest outbreak of this white violence that's ever been seen in the United States. There was a doctor named Dr. Jackson who was taken from his home, even though he had his hands up, and the white mobs took him from his home and they shot him on his front yard. They then looted his home and burned it to the ground to destroy the evidence. White deputized men from the city of Tulsa, white mobs went into Greenwood and repeated this action over and over, killing black people, looting their homes. Men and women, white men and women, came to loot their homes and then burn them to the ground.
The Red Cross, led by Director Maurice Willows, treated hundreds for gunshot wounds and other injuries and burns, mostly black Tulsans. The Red Cross also estimated that 300 persons were killed between May 31st and June 1st in the span of 18 hours. 13 were white, and the rest of the 300 estimated to be killed were black Tulsans.
On that day, within just a few hours on June 1st, 1,256 homes, 35 blocks of Greenwood were burned to the ground. More than 100 businesses were burned, a school, a hospital, and more than a dozen churches. Churches like Mount Zion Baptist, who had just built a nearly 100, in those dollars, millions today, $100,000 church building that was beautiful, it was burned to the ground. No church was spared, no hospital, no school, no life was spared or valued on that day. The National Guard came from Oklahoma City and protected white property. They took black prisoners to two different places, McNulty Park, a baseball park in Tulsa, and the Convention Center, which still stands as a music hall today. Black people were held against their will by the thousands and could only leave if they had a tag that said that they worked for a white person. Working class whites and wealthy whites were all complicit in this. The city of Tulsa was complicit in this violence. The National Guard taking prisoners left Greenwood more vulnerable for all of the violence that was being done. A man named Kitty Booker reported that he was just a young boy when he was told to hide in the attic of his home. He had a beautiful home that his family owned, and his father was taken outside by white mobs. And then they started to burn his house, and his father broke free and got young Kenny and his brothers and sisters out of the attic before the house burned to the ground. A woman named Genevieve Elizabeth Tillman Jackson reported that there were something like birds dropping from airplanes above Greenwood. She couldn't believe her eyes, but what she was seeing were bombs that were being dropped from World War I era airplanes, incendiary devices, bombs being dropped on Greenwood to burn every building in sight. In the aftermath and in the concentration camps, what was called concentration camps at the time in the newspapers, those black families, black individuals who were being held, many fled the city, but they were being held and tried to go back into Greenwood over the next few weeks and rebuild. But the city of Tulsa, within a week, passed a fire ordinance saying that homes couldn't be rebuilt unless they had fire prevention measures and 2 stories of building, effectively trying to prevent the rebuilding because the city and other investment interests wanted that land that these homes were on to build a railroad and other buildings. The city did many things to prevent the rebuilding of Greenwood. They called this a riot and blamed it on the black community. And so no insurance claim for any of the businesses or homes or churches were ever paid, not 1 cent. A man named B.C. Franklin, a black lawyer, challenged this fire ordinance and other injustices in court, and a district court upheld this challenge. And by September of 1921, the first building permits were issued, and the black community began to rebuild. The black community rebuilt Greenwood in spite of white Tulsa not lifting a finger and even trying to prevent the rebuilding of Greenwood. Lumberyards wouldn't even sell lumber to black people. And so the Red Cross, led by Maurice Willows, the director, who stayed through the entire year, aiding those who were injured and providing lumber. 1 million board feet of lumber was provided by the Red Cross in order for black families to rebuild their homes. The story is one of resilience, and not just a massacre, but the resilience of the black community. But at the same time, there has been a 100-year history of white Tulsa not helping the black community in any way or paying any insurance claims or reparations to the survivors of the massacre. When we hear this story, how do we respond? How do you respond in hearing this story? It's a story that was covered up for 50 years. Tulsans, wanting to boost the city, didn't want this story to keep being perpetuated year after year. The story had gone global, but Tulsa did its best to cover it up, literally to bury the story of the Tulsa Race Massacre for more than 50 years, until survivors, very courageous survivors, started telling the story. They received threats. Teachers at Tulsa Community College and OSU received threats when they tried to teach the story of the race massacre and the narrative that I'm sharing with you today. And so the story began to come out. A commission in 2001 was established by the state legislature to study the massacre and also to recommend reparations. The discussion about reparations even began the week after the massacre and has been going for 100 years. And yet the city of Tulsa has given zero in reparations for the complicity in the police department. The fire department watched as houses burned and some of the white armed men threatened them not to put out the fires, and the National Guard taking prisoners. There's deep complicity and guilt in the city and the county and the state for this pogrom, for this ethnic cleansing, for this destruction of Greenwood. So what if white people, like me, like many of you who are watching, hear this history? What can we do? Author Hannibal Johnson suggests 3 things. That we acknowledge the massacre, acknowledge the racial trauma of 1921. Viola Fletcher is 107 years old. She's a resident of Bartlesville, my hometown. She testified before Congress recently, saying that she can still smell the smoke. She can still hear the screams. We need to acknowledge. Hannibal Johnson also says that we need to apologize. City officials at different times in history have apologized, but there has been no reparations. Apology is important, but there must also be action. Atonement. The third that Hannibal Johnson mentions is atonement, which includes action. It includes restitution, which is a biblical idea. Leviticus 6, Luke 19. Scripture speaks of restitution. It's just not often practiced. The white shop owners, where ammo and guns were taken by white men who were deputized and went to kill black people in Greenwood, received restitution. They were paid back for their ammo and guns. Japanese detainees during World War II were paid reparations. Native Americans have been paid reparations. The United States believes in reparations, just not reparations for black people. How can we change this? What can we do on a local level to begin the conversation, to begin action and atonement for these acts of genocide, these acts
of ethnic cleansing, these acts of racial terror.
What if white people, even if it's 100 years later, who burned down 1,256 homes, respond to the historic discrimination in housing with a new effort to build homes in Greenwood and across Tulsa? I got that vision 2 years ago and started what's called the 1256 movement. I'm joining other Christians in Tulsa, donors who are giving funds across the United States and here in Tulsa, with other builders and bankers, lawyers, realtors who want to rebuild Tulsa. We're working with Black-owned businesses, subcontractors to build new homes, paying a $10,000 reparation to those Black families wanting to build new homes and wanting to rehab their homes. We're also paying $10,000 reparation payment. It's not a loan, it's a reparation for the sins of the past, the evil that has been done in this community. This home is in the same community that was burned. Those 35 blocks that were burned, it's in the same community that was burned 100 years ago. And so we have a plan for the next 10 years to build 1,256 homes. We can't do this alone. We need you. We need support of people who are convicted by the story and want to do something about these historic problems of racial discrimination, specifically in housing. And so if you're touched by this story, you can go to 1256movement.org.